If you are wondering about transferring schools, and in particular looking to apply to one of those super duper fancy exclusive schools, then this video is for you. It's both about my experience, but more importantly, the tips that I learned having gone through the whole, shebang. In terms of my personal story, I started off at NYU studying business and political economy through the business school. In my first year, I realized I didn't want to be in business school anymore, and so in my second year, I applied to transfer. I ended up going to Harvard, where I studied computer science and philosophy. This is not a video about the pros and cons of either school. This is a video about transferring, so let's get into that. So some words of wisdom before we start. The first is that I only applied to schools I would rather go to, so I only applied to, I think, 5 super selective schools because it actually saved me time rather than applying to 20 schools, some of which were probably equal in my head to the school that I was currently at. My second phrase of wisdom, which I think is the most important, is that when I was writing every application for each school, I convinced myself that this was absolutely the perfect school for me and I would love it and blah blah blah. And so essentially it really helped me write my application to be in that mindset, and then as soon as I pressed submit, I completely changed my attitude such that I felt like if I stayed, it would be amazing. If I left, it would be amazing too. In fact, I even mentally had given myself a reward that if I didn't transfer, I would get a cat and have an amazing apartment in New York, etc. And I think having that kind of dual attitude and being able to convince yourself that you really want it and that it's going to totally be okay because it is super healthy throughout a very stressful process. Okay, so first I'm going to go through the 4 reasons why I personally transferred, and hopefully they might inspire you or put some words to the feelings that you currently have, which is why you're watching this video. And then after that, I'm going to go through tips on what I think are good or bad things to write on your why do you want to transfer application essay. Huge disclaimer, I'm by no means telling you to lie. I'm also by no means telling you to be schemy, and lots of people ignore the rules that I'm going to say and get in because they're super authentic and amazing and all these things. But I do think they will be helpful in terms of being thoughtful, in terms of who is actually reading your application. Okay, so to begin, we're going to go through the 4 reasons as to why I transferred. The first is social, which is that I didn't really feel like I belonged to this community in particular. Now, in hindsight, I would say I didn't necessarily give a lot to the community, and what can you really expect to get back in that situation? But regardless, that's how I felt at the time. The second was actually financial. NYU is a notoriously expensive school with bad financial aid, according to everyone in the US. I'm Canadian. I didn't realize that. But with time, I learned that Ivies have really fantastic financial aid programs, so that was a consideration of mine. And then the third was actually the environment. So, this is NYU is one of those schools that's in the city, and this is amazing for lots of reasons and amazing for lots of people. But personally, I felt after having been there for a while, I was like, wow, I can be an employee / an adult for the rest of my life if I really want to, but when am I going to be in a small liberal arts town that's kind of isolated, but get to really be a student in that environment? So that was the third consideration of mine. And then finally, I, as I said earlier, did not want to be in business school anymore. Long story, but essentially I realized the value of a liberal arts education, and I wanted to change what I studied. So that was the core reason as to why I transferred. Okay, so now we are going to go through tips on what I think are categorically good and categorically bad answers for your why do you want to transfer part of the application. Again, disclaimer, this is not meant to be scheming. I'm not telling you to lie. In fact, being authentic and storytelling your personal story is the most important part of this entire application, but I do think you should think about who your reader is. So in terms of categorically good answers, I would say you've really thoughtfully considered for yourself in relation to the school that you're applying to individually, why you want to go there. So for example, let's say your freshman year, you realize that your passion was actually psychology and you've been studying biology this whole time. And your current school is not that amazing at psychology, but there's this other school that's amazing at psychology. It has this professor that wrote this book you really love. You would love to write a thesis with them, etc. That's a categorically good reason to write on your application because you've shown that you've thought about how you would fit in that school, and the reasons you want to transfer are in that school's control, and so a person from that school reading your application is like, ah, that makes a lot of sense. What I would consider categorically bad answers probably just neglect like the school that you're applying to and what your relation to them genuinely is. Okay, let me like ground that in an example. If you go to a phenomenal writing program right now and you're like, I'm going to transfer to a school that is canonically known for having a worse or equal writing program, but it's more prestigious, that's just probably like a categorically bad reason to write on your transfer application, in that it is outside of the school's control. It does not show that you've been thoughtful about why you want to attend that school, and so that comes off. Now, again, not saying you should lie, I'm just saying you should consider who your reader is. Okay, so now I'm going to give 4 very specific pieces of advice for applying to the most competitive schools out there to transfer to. So my first piece of advice is that you should apply because you miss 100% of the shots you don't take, according to a great Canadian, and this is so, so true. You will regret not knowing what would have happened had you done it, so you should just do it. With that being said, really acknowledge that at the end of it, a lot of it is luck. For example, let's give some numbers. When I was applying, Princeton that year was taking 12 transfer students. Most of the most competitive schools, so like Harvard and Yale and Stanford and Princeton, take somewhere between like 10 and 30 students, so very, very few. So anyways, Princeton was taking 12. Half of them were saved for ex-military, in other words, people who couldn't apply the first time around. So this left 6 spots, and let's say there were 1,500 applicants, and let's say 150 of them were genuinely equally qualified. Those last 6 spots come down to, how people were feeling the day of, and it's just a lot of luck when it comes down to that final pool of most competitive people. All of that is to say, 100% apply because you will regret not knowing. At the same time, acknowledge that it is totally a lot of luck. Okay, so my second piece of advice is kind of odd and anecdotal, but I just want to communicate that I've observed among many different transfer classes that they tend to be a little bit weirder than like regular admissions. What I just mean by that is, if you think of a regular class, the schools are trying to fill like a whole breadth of people, but after regular admissions, they've already filled that breadth of people. They might not like need the 10th person who fits this persona. Not that people are the same, but there are personas. So all of that is to say, I've kind of just like noticed that transfer people tend to be a little bit weirder than the average class as a whole. This is not to say that you should lie and be weirder than you are, but perhaps this means that you should be even more authentic and more like strange in your own way that might actually work to your favor in transfer applications to really, really competitive schools. Okay, so my third piece of advice has sub-tips, but the overall tip is that you should write your application as a personal narrative. This is so, so important for every application. It is not a resume, it is not a list, it is a narrative. One of the reasons why this is great is because humans are actually very, very bad at remembering details, but they are very good at remembering stories. So you might be wondering, like, how do you actually write like that? Well, I have very specific sub-tips for this. The first is show, don't tell. I edit a lot of people's applications for fun, for like my friends and their siblings and things like that. And one thing that I notice is that it's very, very common for people to write something to the effect of, I am a really passionate learner or something like that. The issue is, let's say 1,000 people write, I am a really passionate learner. It is really hard for the person who is reading it to understand why this passionate learner is like more passionate or less passionate than this passionate learner. Which is why if you can give a specific example, aka showing, it doesn't have to be impressive, but it will be so much more memorable because it is individual to you and it is a story and it just explains so much more. My second sub-tip is just good for writing in general, which is that if you have the time, you should actually go through word by word and ask yourself, is this adding to the story? If it's not, take it out. Again, I read applications all the time that have 3 words that say effectively the same thing, and so you're really wasting 2 of them and you're taking away from the story, so don't include it. The third specific piece of advice for writing great narratives is that you should have really researched the school that you want to transfer to and have very specific answers as to why you would really fit into that school in particular. So for example, if you're asking yourself like, why do I want to go to Harvard? There are lots of answers that lots of people can say, which are bad answers because, again, everyone can say them. But a good answer is like something very specific to you, like, oh, I used to love olives and I used to eat them with my dad when I was 4, and that led me to horticulture, which led me to biology in high school. And then I read this paper by this Harvard professor who actually teaches a class in the spring semester that I would really love to attend, like, etc., etc. As you can see, I'm not saying anything particularly impressive, like I'm not saying I won the science Olympiad, but instead I'm telling a very specific story based on the research that I've done for a school, which makes everything just so much more compelling and so much more memorable. My last sub-tip is that when you're writing, more importantly, when you're editing your application, you need to read it from the eyes of the people who are going to be reading your application. It is unbelievably easy to, as you write your application, just be like, I want to communicate this with the world. But the issue is, or what's not thoughtful about that, is you need to understand what you're coming across as to the people who are actually reading your application. And a really good way to do this, again, if you have the time, is you can actually mark under every paragraph that you've written for an application, like what this communicates in a word or two. You're like, oh, this communicates my interest in science. This paragraph communicates I care about my family. This paragraph communicates, my interest in biology in particular, which, again, I say that again in like paragraph 6. One of the great things about this is you're just more thoughtful about how you actually come across. And then second of all, you can go through an entire application and say, have I covered and communicated everything I want to, or are there things that I'm missing that I actually want to add? Okay, my fourth and final piece of advice is use every single part of your application to your advantage because you will need it in really, really competitive processes. So for example, when it comes to your activities list, try your best to not make it just a resume of random things. You should think about, am I telling some sort of a cohesive story? Am I saying, oh, I'm really interested in technology, specifically supporting women? Am I saying, I've always been interested in all of the sciences? Or are you just, listing things that your parents made you do? Also, in your activities list or somewhere in your essay, try and communicate the why you do things. There's just an enormous difference between people who have done things because they thought it was the right thing to do or because other people told them to, versus some intrinsic motivation or some intrinsic values that you have that led you to the things that you did. When it comes to your recommendations, obviously you want it to be as good as possible. I think 2 minor things that helped mine was, 1, on my transfer transcript, there was room for teachers to write something optional, and one of my teachers very unprompted wrote something, which I thought, was nice. And then also I got an extra recommendation from one of my extracurricular leaders, which I think just corroborated a lot of the things that I had been saying all along, and I thought that was very useful. In your personal essays, there is no such thing as a throwaway essay. So for example, in my Harvard app, there was a question that was like, what would you do if you didn't get in? And at first, I essentially wrote one sentence that was, I would stay. Thank you for asking this great question. And then I went back and actually wrote a thoughtful answer about, what's my philosophy on changing my life and what's my philosophy on what I would do if I stayed. In other words, I just made better use of those 500 words to actually communicate something. And then finally, in your interview, if you get one, or if you, have one, most of these really competitive schools, I believe, say they don't do interviews. I actually did have a couple. I think it kind of depends on the school and the year. But if you do have one, you want to put your best foot forward. And so what I did was actually practice in front of a mirror. This tells you a lot of things. 1, it shows you like the weird things you might do with your body without realizing it. And then the other thing is there are questions that you pretty much know you're going to be asked, like, tell me about yourself, or like, tell me about this activity. And while you should not have a memorized answer, you should know approximately where you're going with the answer because you have a lot of time to think about it. And then, obviously, if all the stars and moon aligns with all of these pieces of the essay, then you know that you've put your best foot forward, and that's like the best that you can say. I'm going to read a little bit of my Harvard essay. It's really not that deep, but I think the meaning of this paragraph is there, which is, if I was accepted to Harvard as I would sit on Harvard Yard during graduation, I would think to myself, I would not have met A, and I would not accomplish B had the course of my life not been forever altered by transferring. But I also know that if I do not transfer, I will meet X and I will accomplish Y, and the course of my life would be altered just in a different way. I think this really well sums up my overall point, which is you should apply like you mean it, because otherwise, seriously, like, why are you going to spend the time? And then once it's outside of your hands, it's totally fine, and like take solace in the fact that you are awesome, you tried your best, and your life is going to be great regardless. Good luck. I hope you learned something from this, and if you have more questions, feel free to leave them in the comment section below.